I still remember the sound, not the chainsaw itself, but the laughter that came after it. That easy. Satisfied kind of laughter people have when they think they've gotten away with something. By the time I pulled into my driveway that Friday afternoon, the cedar privacy fence my wife and I had spent 3 weekends building 12 years earlier was lying in neat low piles, cut into sections like it had never belonged there at all. And standing where my fence used to be was my new neighbor, Graham Whitmore, holding a cold beer while waving at me like he'd just done me the biggest favor in the world. "Don't worry," he called across the yard before I even shut off the truck. "We cleaned everything up for you." I sat there for a second with both hands still on the steering wheel, trying to convince myself there had to be some explanation that didn't involve a grown man deciding my property was suddenly his. My name's Nathan Cole, and until Graham and his wife Melissa bought the house next door, I figured I would probably live out the rest of my life on that little corner lot outside Brookhaven without ever having a serious disagreement with a neighbor. It wasn't a fancy neighborhood, just one of those older American suburbs where people still wave from their front porches, where kids rode bicycles until the street lights came on, where everybody knew whose dog kept digging under whose fence. My wife Laura loved our backyard because it felt private, surrounded by old maple trees that shaded the vegetable garden she'd been tending since our daughter Emily was in elementary school. We weren't rich people, but we'd spent years turning that yard into our favorite place in the world, every flower bed planted together, every fence board stained by hand, every summer evening ending around a little fire pit with neighbors who actually liked each other. Then Graham moved in, and from the beginning, it felt like he looked at the neighborhood less as a community and more as a project waiting for him to improve it. Within 2 weeks, he replaced the mailbox, ripped out half the landscaping, hired contractors to tear up the driveway, and somehow managed to tell almost everyone within earshot how outdated the entire street looked. At first, I honestly thought he was just enthusiastic, maybe one of those guys who couldn't sit still without renovating something. Then little comments started slipping into conversations. "You know," he said one Saturday while pretending to admire the trees between our yards, "I've been looking at these property lines, and I think your fence has been in the wrong spot for years." I laughed because I assumed he was joking. "Well," I answered, "it's been there longer than I've owned the place, and that was almost 13 years ago." He shrugged with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Does it mean it's right?" Most people would have forgotten a comment like that, but Graham didn't. Over the next month, I noticed him measuring things when he thought nobody was watching. Sometimes he'd stand with a contractor pointing toward the fence. Sometimes he'd stick little orange flags in the grass, only to remove them before dinner. One afternoon, I walked outside to grab the mail and caught him stretching a tape measure from his garage toward our property line. "Planning something?" I asked. He smiled again, that same polite smile that somehow felt more insulting than if he'd just frowned. "Just figuring out where my land actually ends." I answered. "County records are pretty easy to find if you're curious." He chuckled. "Sometimes records are wrong." That sentence stayed with me longer than it probably should have. Laura told me not to let it bother me. "He's just trying to impress everyone," she said while watering tomatoes. "Some people need to feel like they're the smartest guy on the block." I wanted to believe she was right. Unfortunately, Graham wasn't interested in sounding smart. He wanted 6 more feet of backyard. About 3 weeks later, he knocked on my front door carrying a rolled-up sketch that looked like it had been printed off somebody's home design software. Without even saying hello, he spread it across my porch railing. "We're putting in a new storage shed back here," he explained, pointing toward the corner where a fence stood. "And honestly, it'd fit a lot better if we straightened that fence line." I looked at the drawing, then back at him. "Straightened?" "Yeah," he said casually. "Move it over about 6 feet. It'll clean up the property boundary." "Makes more sense." I stared at him because I couldn't tell whether he were serious. 6 feet into my yard. "Well, technically, we think it's ours." "Who's we?" "Me and a contractor." I actually laughed. That's not really how property ownership works. His expression hardened just enough for me to notice. "You'll see." It wasn't a threat exactly. It was worse. It sounded like a man who had already decided the outcome before anyone else had even entered the conversation. I wish I'd understood what he meant that afternoon, because the following Friday, while Laura and I were both at work, Graham hired a crew that cut down our entire fence without asking permission, without a survey, without a phone call, and before sunset they'd already spread fresh gravel across the strip of land where our fence had stood. By the next morning, stacks of lumber had been delivered. Concrete blocks were sitting neatly beside the gravel pad, and Graham was proudly explaining to another neighbor how much bigger his backyard suddenly felt. Meanwhile, I stood there staring at the empty space where years of memories had once been. And for just a moment, I wondered if maybe this was exactly what he wanted. for me to lose my temper, to scream, to threaten him, to become the unreasonable neighbor everyone remembered. But instead, I simply looked down at the ground. Noticed the old concrete footing from my original fence posts still buried exactly where we'd poured them years earlier. And that's when I realized something Graham hadn't. Wood can be cut down in an afternoon. Property lines can't. I didn't say another word to Graham that weekend. And I could tell it bothered him because every time he wandered into his backyard, he'd glance over like he was waiting for the shouting match that never came. Funny thing about people who expect a fight, silence makes them nervous. Laura kept asking what I was thinking. And honestly, I wasn't completely sure yet. I just knew I wasn't about to settle a property dispute by yelling across a fence that no longer existed. Monday morning, I called a licensed surveyor named Curtis Hale, a man who'd spent nearly 30 years settling boundary disputes all over the county. He listened to my story without interrupting, then asked one question that immediately made me feel better. Do you know where the original corner monuments are? I told him I remembered seeing metal pins years earlier before we'd landscaped the backyard. He smiled. Good. If those pins are still there, opinions don't matter much. 3 days later, Curtis arrived with 2 assistants, tripods, GPS equipment, old subdivision maps, and copies of records dating back to when the neighborhood had first been developed. Graham came outside almost immediately, coffee mug in hand, wearing that same confident grin. Guess we're finally getting this settled, he called. Curtis looked at him politely and replied, that's exactly why we're here. For nearly 4 hours they measured, checked bearings, uncovered buried markers, compared historical plats, and confirmed every angle for multiple reference points. I stayed out of their way while Laura watched quietly from the patio. Around lunchtime, Curtis walked over holding a folder and said words I already suspected were coming. Nathan, your fence wasn't 6 feet onto his property. He paused. It was actually about 3 inches inside yours the entire time. I laughed because I couldn't help it. 12 years of worrying, we'd accidentally crossed the line, and we'd actually given ourselves less yard than we owned. Graham didn't laugh. Curtis invited both of us to look at the survey markers he'd just installed. Bright orange stakes now formed a perfectly straight line, and right through the middle of Graham's brand new gravel pad. Worse than that, nearly 1/3 of the storage shed foundation his contractors had started laying was sitting squarely on my property. Graham folded his arms. Your equipment must be wrong. Curtis calmly answered, our equipment is calibrated every morning. The county monuments hadn't moved since 1988. Graham pointed toward the old fence footing. Then why was the fence there? Curtis looked at him without changing expression. Because your neighbor built it slightly inside his own property. He actually gave himself less land. That explanation should have ended everything. But people who convince themselves they're right don't usually surrender just because reality shows up carrying paperwork. Graham crossed his arms tighter and muttered, I'm getting another survey. Curtis simply nodded. You're welcome to. As soon as the survey crew left, Graham walked over to my driveway. I'm not moving anything, he said. We'll let lawyers figure it out. I answered, that's your choice. I think he expected me to argue. Instead, I thanked him for letting me know and went back inside. That evening, Laura asked if we should call an attorney. Already did, I told her. The next week, our attorney, Denise Morton, mailed Graham a formal demand letter that included the certified survey, historical aerial photographs, subdivision plats, copies of county records, and a simple request: restore the property line, remove every improvement built across it, and replace the fence he'd destroyed. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional. It just laid out the facts. Graham's response arrived 6 days later through his own attorney. One sentence stood out more than anything else. Our clients deny all allegations and intend to continue improvements to their property. Laura read it twice before looking at me. They're actually doubling down. They were. Within another month, the shed was fully built. It wasn't some little garden box either. Graham had poured a reinforced concrete slab, installed electricity, mounted security lights, added gutters, and even painted the thing dark green to match his house. Every nail he drove cost him more money, and every improvement sat partially on land that wasn't his. I couldn't understand why anyone would gamble that much on something already proven wrong, until Denise explained it. He's hoping you'll get tired, she said. A lot of people walk away because lawsuits are exhausting. What if I don't? She smiled. Then eventually he'll have to explain to a judge why he ignored a certified survey. Weeks passed. Summer settled over the neighborhood, and everyone pretended not to notice the awkward silence between our houses. Neighbors whispered while walking dogs. Some quietly stopped by to ask how things were going. One older gentleman named Frank admitted Graham had asked him months earlier whether anyone would notice if a fence got moved. Frank thought it was just conversation. Looking back, he wished he'd said something sooner. Around that time, Denise called with an idea that completely changed the direction of the case. "Nathan," she said, "you've mentioned for years that you'd like more privacy from the backyard." "Sure, then maybe it's time." She explained something surprisingly simple. Since the survey officially established my property line, I had every legal right to build a masonry privacy screen entirely on my own land as long as it complied with local zoning and setback regulations. I wasn't building it to punish Graham. On paper, it served three legitimate purposes: privacy from his new security lights, noise reduction because he'd started running power equipment late into the evening, and wind protection for Laura's vegetable garden. Denise leaned back in her chair. "The law doesn't require you to leave open space beside a structure someone illegally placed on your property." Suddenly, the whole picture became clear. I wasn't asking anyone to trap his shed. I was simply reclaiming my own land exactly as the law allowed. We hired an architect to design a beautiful brick privacy screen, not some ugly wall meant to provoke people, but a carefully planned structure with decorative columns, textured brickwork, limestone caps, and climbing ivy planned for the finished surface. Every measurement matched county requirements. Every permit was approved. Every inspection passed before construction even began. The morning the bricklayers arrived, Graham walked outside laughing. "Building a castle," he yelled. "Just improving my backyard," I answered. "Thought you liked improvements." He rolled his eyes and went back inside. The first few days, nothing looked unusual. Workers dug footings exactly along the surveyed property line. Steel reinforcement went in. Concrete cured. Then the brickwork started rising. One row became 5, 5 became 20. And by the end of the second week, the elegant brick screen stretched almost the entire length of our shared boundary. That's when Graham finally noticed something he'd somehow overlooked. The side of his shed sat only a few inches from the property line. My wall wasn't touching it. It didn't need to. Once completed, there simply wasn't enough room left to access that side of the structure anymore. His shed door still opened, but only partway because the roof overhang projected toward the wall. Maintenance became nearly impossible. Cleaning gutters required special equipment. Exterior repairs could no longer be done for my property because I had every legal right to deny access. Graham stormed across his lawn while the masons were finishing the last decorative column. "You planned this," he shouted. I calmly answered. "I planned a privacy wall." "You trapped my shed." "No. You trapped your shed when you built it on someone else's property." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The workers kept laying brick as though they couldn't hear us. Graham finally pointed at the wall. "Move it." I shook my head. "It's exactly where my land begins." He laughed once, bitterly. "This isn't over." "I know," I replied quietly. "The county inspector comes Tuesday." The confidence disappeared from his face so quickly it almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost, because Tuesday wasn't just another inspection. It was the beginning of a chain reaction neither of us could stop anymore. And once the county started measuring more than just the property line, they discovered problems that had absolutely nothing to do with my wall. The electrical wiring inside the shed had never received final approval. The drainage system violated runoff regulations. The concrete slab exceeded the permitted footprint. And the structure itself failed setback requirements even if the property dispute hadn't existed. By the end of the afternoon, Graham wasn't arguing with me anymore. He was arguing with 3 county officials carrying clipboards. And for the first time since this whole mess began, I realized the fence had never really been the biggest mistake he'd made. It was believing that confidence could replace paperwork. For the next several weeks, the neighborhood turned unusually quiet. Not because people had lost interest, but because everyone was waiting to see who would blink first. Graham stopped making jokes whenever I walked outside. The contractors who had been at his house almost every weekend disappeared, and instead there were survey flags, inspectors' vehicles, and eventually his attorney's sedan parked along the curb more often than not. One afternoon, Denise called me and said, "I think they're ready to talk." Those were the words I'd been expecting for months, not because I wanted some dramatic victory, but because I wanted my backyard back. We met at the mediation office across town, and for the first time since this whole thing started, Graham wasn't loud, confident, or sarcastic. He looked tired. His attorney did most of the talking, acknowledging the certified survey, the county findings, and the inspection reports. After hours of negotiation, an agreement was finally reached. Graham would remove the shed entirely at his own expense, restore the original property line, pay for replacing the fence his crew had destroyed, reimburse my survey and legal costs, repair the damaged landscaping, and sign a formal agreement recognizing the boundary exactly as recorded by the county. When Denise slid the paperwork toward me, she smiled and whispered, Sometimes the longest way around becomes the shortest way home. About a month later, I stood in my backyard with a cup of coffee as another construction crew arrived. Only this time, they weren't building anything. They were taking everything apart. Piece by piece, the shed disappeared. The roof came off first, then the walls, then the framing, and finally the concrete slab was broken apart and hauled away. I never celebrated. I never stood outside to watch. In fact, I spent most of that weekend helping Laura replant flowers where tire tracks had torn through the garden months earlier. She looked over at the brick screen, now covered with the first vines we'd planted, and quietly said, "It finally feels like home again." I realized she wasn't talking about the fence or the property line. She was talking about peace. A few days later, our new cedar fence was installed exactly where the survey markers had always said it belonged. Funny enough, we actually gained a few inches of yard because the old fence had never been built on the true boundary to begin with. Frank, the neighbor from across the street, wandered over while I was staining the fresh boards. He leaned on the fence and laughed. "You know," he said, "everyone thought this was going to end with somebody screaming or getting arrested." I smiled. "Turns out paperwork is louder than yelling." He nodded. "I've lived here almost 30 years, and that's probably the most expensive 6 feet of grass I've ever seen." Word spread through the neighborhood, and little by little people started telling me stories I'd never heard before. Graham had argued with another homeowner about tree branches, complained that an elderly couple's mailbox was too close to the road, even tried convincing someone else their driveway crossed his property. Most folks had simply given in because the disagreement seemed too small to fight over. Looking back, I don't think Graham was bored a bad person. I think he convinced himself that if he acted certain enough, everyone else would eventually doubt themselves. The problem was that facts don't care about confidence. Survey markers don't get intimidated. County records don't change because somebody talks louder. Every brick in that privacy screen reminds me of that lesson. People sometimes ask if I regret building it. And honestly, no. I don't see it as a monument to revenge. I see it as a reminder that patience usually outlasts pride. Had I reacted with anger the day my fence was cut down, I'd probably have become exactly what Graham hoped I'd become. Another emotional neighbor making threats without evidence. Instead, every decision was documented, permitted, inspected, and backed by people whose job was simply to follow the facts wherever they led. That's not nearly as exciting in the moment, but it's a whole lot more effective in the end. Every now and then I'll catch someone slowing down while walking past the house, glancing at that brick screen before continuing down the sidewalk. They probably don't know the whole story anymore. They just see a nice wall, a clean fence, and 2 ordinary backyards. And honestly, that's exactly how I want it. The best ending wasn't watching a shed come down. It was waking up one morning and realizing I no longer thought about Graham at all. The argument ended. The property line stayed where it had always been, and life moved forward, which is really the only victory that lasts. But I'll leave you with one question, because people still disagree whenever the story comes up. If someone knowingly cuts down your fence, claims part of your land, ignores a professional survey, and builds anyway, would you have handled it the same way? Or would you have confronted them the very first day? Let me know what you honestly think in the comments. Was the brick screen simply a homeowner exercising his legal rights? Or did it cross the line into quiet revenge? I'd really like to hear where you stand. And if you've ever dealt with neighbors, property disputes, or situations where patience won instead of anger, share your story below. Don't forget to like the video. Subscribe for more real-life neighborhood conflicts and property stories. And I'll see you in the next one.